So you've created your query, and when you hit refresh, you get the dreaded "the table of the column wasn't found" error. Or when you import your files from a folder into Power Query, instead of all your files being quickly combined, you get the elusive "the key didn't match any rows in the table" message. What does that even mean, and how do you fix these errors? Well, in this video, we're going to work through 4 different scenarios that shows you how to avoid these types of errors which are caused by hard coding in your queries. And instead, I'll show you how to make your queries more dynamic. We have these 2 tables and they're exactly the same. And here we have the queries for these tables. If there had to be a change in a column name here in our first table, let's say sales rep name changed to sales rep, and we hit refresh, we get the column of the table wasn't found error. But if the same change happened here in our second table and we hit refresh, our query updates to show the changed column name without any errors. Let's go to our query editor to find out how we can do this. Here in our query editor, there is no error in our source step, but there is an error here in our change type step. So when we changed our column name from sales rep name to sales rep, Power Query returned an error, as all the column names were hard-coded here in the change type step. So when Power Query wants to perform the change type step, it searches for the column called sales rep name, and as it can't find it, it returns an error. So we need to make our change type step dynamic and not have these hard-coded values. Here in our formula bar, we have our function called table.transformColumnTypes that's used to perform our change type step. This function requires our first parameter, which is our input, to be a table, which in this case is source. And the second parameter needs to be a list, which in this case are our column headers. And lists are always in curly brackets. So we need to make our second parameter of our change type step dynamic, as this is where our hard-coded text is. First, let's duplicate this query. Let's remove the change type step. Next, here in our Home tab, let's click on Keep Rows and click on Keep Top Rows. The number of rows that we want to keep is 1. Next, in the Transform tab, click on the drop-down for Use First Row as Headers and click Use Headers as First Row. So we're demoting our headers. When Power Query performs the demoted headers step, it performed the change type step. We don't need it, so let's exit out. Next, in the Transform tab, click on Transpose, and we've transposed our table with our column headers in the first column and the values in the second column. Let's rename this query to Sales Data. Next, in the Add Column tab, let's click on Custom Column, and let's type if and select column 2 here from our available columns, equals null, then type any dot type, else value dot type. And let's select column 2 again, and remember to add your parentheses around the second column too, as we're using a function value.type on this column, and hit OK. And we have a new column that has our data type for each column header. Let's select column 1, hold down the Control key, and select our custom column. Right-click and select Remove Other Columns. Next, let's transpose our table again. In the formula bar, let's click on the FX step, and a new Custom 1 step is added, and it references our previous step. This is the sequence in which M-code works. A step always starts by referencing the previous step. If you would like to learn more on M-code and the advanced editor, I highly recommend you watch this video here. I'll leave the link in the description also. Now we need to convert this entire table to a list. Why do we need to do this? Let's go back to our sales data not dynamic query, and for our change type step, aka table.transformColumnTypes, our second parameter needs to be a list. And this is the parameter that we want to be dynamic. So let's go back to our sales data query, and here in our formula bar, before transpose table 1, let's type table.toColumns. The IntelliSense brings it up. And remember to insert the parentheses around transpose table 1, as we're applying a function to this. And functions always have parentheses, just like in Excel. And hit enter, and we have a list of nested lists. And if we look at our icon on the left here, it's changed to a list, and it's no longer a table. Let's rename this to CN list for column name list. You can name it whatever you like. Each list has our column name and what type that column is. So if we click on one of these lists, we can see the contents of that list. And if we click on the type, we can see what the data type is. In this case, it's text. Let's remove these last two steps, as it was just to show you the contents of the list. Let's go back to our sales data not dynamic query, and now all we need to do is go to our change type step, and here in the formula bar, delete our entire second parameter and start typing CN list. Let's select it from the IntelliSense and hit enter, and our query is fixed. Let's test it out. Let's send this back to Excel. In our source data, let's change amount to sales amount and hit refresh, and our query correctly updates our column name. So we've now made our change type step dynamic. In our next example, we have our data in this format, and we've created a function that performs a data cleanup and transforms that data to this format here. However, when we input region 2's data into our function, we get this error. The column sales rep of the table wasn't found. So a step in our function is hard-coding the sales rep column, which is preventing our function from being dynamic. Let's see how we can fix this. Let's start from scratch and create our function. First, let's duplicate our region 1 query and call it data cleanup. Let's remove our change type step, as we will perform it at the end. Next, let's remove our MTD sales column, as we don't need that in our end query. Let's rename sales rep to representative, as this is the column name that caused our column of the table wasn't found error. So renaming the inconsistent column name here will help us have the same column names across our queries. As if we compare our region 1 and region 2 column headers, the only inconsistent column name was sales rep in region 1 and rep in region 2. Let's go back to our data cleanup query and select our representative column. Right-click and select Unpivot Other Columns. In our formula bar, let's change attribute to month and value to sales amount. So this is the cleanup that we want our function to perform. But before we convert this to a function, let's check our steps that have hard-coded text and see which of those we need to make dynamic to prevent our function from failing. Our removed column step has MTD sales as our hard-coded text, but it's the same name in both our tables. So we don't need to be concerned with the removed column step. Our renamed column step has sales rep and representative hard-coded, and our unpivoted other column step also has all these as hard-coded text. Let's make our renamed column step dynamic, and to do this, we will use the table.columnNames function. Let's create a blank query so that I can quickly show you what this function does. In our formula bar, let's type equals table.columnNames, and in brackets, type the name of our table, which is region 1, and hit enter. And we get a list of our column names. Now the column name that we want returned is sales rep. So let's type 0 in curly brackets, as Power Query is 0 based, and hit enter, and sales rep is returned. So whatever column name is in position 0 is going to be returned. Let's copy this code, and let's go to our data cleanup query, and here in the renamed column step, let's paste our code over sales rep, and hit enter. And our query looks the same, but it's not. We will test it out in a few minutes. Our unpivoted other column step has these column names as hard-coded text, but these won't cause any errors, as once the renamed column step is applied across our tables, all our column names will be the same. Let's perform a change type step. Next, let's create our function. Let's open up our advanced editor. And here's the code that Power Query generated for us. Let's add a space before let, and here's where we will tell Power Query this is a function. The first part of our function relates to what our input needs to be. Let's name the input, as everything is named in Power Query. Just like our applied steps, let's call this input sales data. And remember the brackets. You can name it whatever you like. We also need to define our input type. My input will be tables, so type as table. Outside of our brackets, type the arrow operator, which indicates to Power Query this is a function. So everything before the arrow operator is our input to our function, and everything after the arrow operator is what must be done to that input. The source step brings in our source data, which is region 1. Let's cut this entire step as we don't need it, as sales data will bring in our source data. Let's also replace source everywhere else in our query with sales data. It's here in the removed column step, and we need to replace region 1 in our table.columnNames function with sales data. As if we don't, we're going to get an error when we input region 2 in our function. We've now converted our query to a function. Let's hit done, and let's test out our function. Let's invoke our region 2 sales data, and our function correctly performed our data cleanup. And we can test it out on our region 1 data, and it's correctly performed our function on region 1. Now we need to combine our weekly data that's added to our folder. The structure of the data is the same. The only difference is that each sheet has a different name. Let me know in the comments if you already know what error we're going to get when we upload this to Power Query. In a blank workbook, let's go to Data, Get Data, From File, From Folder. I've copied my folder path, so I'm just going to paste it and click Open. Power Query displays the files in our folder, which are correct. We want to combine and transform our data, so let's select that. Here in our Combine Files dialog box, Power Query chooses our first file as the sample file. So when we connect to a folder to combine all our files, you'll see in a few minutes that Power Query creates a query called sample file, which is used as an example to process each file. It's important to note that the end results of our end query will depend on the columns that exist in the sample file. You can click on the drop-down to select any of your files as the sample, but let's keep our first file, which is week 1, as our sample. Let's click on the sheet here to select it. Remember, this was not in a table format, but that's fine, as Power Query will perform the transformations for us. And click OK. And here are all the queries that Power Query has generated for us to get our end result here, which is this table called Weekly Sales. But only our Week 1 data has imported correctly, and we have this error here which says the key didn't match any rows in the table, and then it gives us the details here. So if you guessed that this would be our error, you were right. This error means that Power Query is trying to access the sheet 2023-0505 in our Week 2 and Week 3 sheets. But this sheet does not exist, or let's rather say it has a different name each week. To fix this error, we need to go to our transform sample file query. This query does exactly what it says. It performs transformations on our sample file that we chose, which was week 1. So any changes made to this transform sample file query will be reflected here in our transform file function. And this function is then applied to all the files in our folder before combining them into one table. So for example, in our transform sample file, if we had to click on Add Column, and go to Date, Month, Name of Month, we get our month names here in our transform sample file. And if we check our end query, it also has our month name. So we need to make our changes here in our transform sample file query. Let's take a look at the applied steps of this query. Our source step brings in our data, and here in our navigation step, we have this section of code between the curly brackets, where our sheet name has been hard-coded. So to make this section of hard coding dynamic, let's instead replace this entire section of code with just a 0 between the curly brackets. This 0 is the position of the first sheet in each of our Excel files. So in Excel, sheet 1 is position 0, sheet 2 is position 1, and so forth. So we know that the data that we want is always going to be in our first sheet in each of our files. So instead of using the sheet name, we can rather use the position of the sheet. Let's click on our end query, and we can see that all our files in our folder have been successfully combined, and our error of the key didn't match any rows in the table is fixed. Let's rename source name to week, and in the Transform tab, let's click on Extract, and let's select Text Before Delimiter, and let's type the dot, and click OK. And we've removed our Excel extension, and we can send this to Excel. We have our end query here in Excel, which is generated from these 3 sheets that were combined in Power Query. If one of these sheets had to have an additional column added to it, and if we go back to our query and hit refresh, our query doesn't update to show the new column. Let's see how we can fix this. We're going to start from scratch so that you can see how we uploaded and combined the data. First, let's copy the path to our workbook. Then, in a blank workbook, go to Data, Get Data, from File, from Excel Workbook, as all 3 sheets were in the same workbook. And let's paste our path here and click Open. Here in the Navigator tab, let's select our folder, which is our Excel workbook, and click on Transform Data. Here in our query editor, Power Query shows us the files that it's found in our workbook. The column that has our data is the data column. Power Query is so literal, it makes a dictionary look like a joke book. Let's select our data column, right-click, and select Remove Other Columns. Next, let's click on the Expand icon, and remember to uncheck Use Original Column Name as Prefix, and click OK. And we have all our sheets combined. Next, let's filter out Region 1, 2, and 3 sales data. These were the headings in each of our sheets. We don't need those, and click OK. And let's click on this table icon on the left here, and click Use First Row as Headers, and our headers have been promoted. We also have the column headers for Region 2 and 3, so let's filter out Region, and the headers have been filtered out. Now, the step that's preventing new columns from being added to our end query is the expanded data step, as it's hard-coded our column names. So we need to make this step dynamic. Let's click on our second step after source, which is the Removed Other Column step. Right-click and select Delete Until End, and select Delete. Before we combine these tables, we first need to get our headers promoted in each table, as they're all the way in row 2 in each of our tables. In the Add Column tab, let's click on Custom Column, and let's type table.removeFirstN, and insert the open brackets, and select the data column, and insert the close brackets, and hit OK. And we've removed our first row. Now to promote our headers in each of our tables, let's go back to our custom column step, and after the equal sign, let's type table.promoteHeaders, and insert our brackets, and hit OK. And our headers have been promoted in each of our tables. Next, let's select our custom column, right-click, and select Remove Other Columns. Now, it's really tempting to click the Expand Tables icon, but we're not going to do that, as remember that's the step that hard-coded our column names. Let's instead click on the Transform tab and click on Convert to List. And our one-column table is now in a list format that we can use in our next function. In our formula bar, let's type table.combine after the equal sign and insert our brackets, This function merges a list of tables into one table. This is why we had to convert our tables to a list so that we could input it into this function and hit OK. And all our sheets have been successfully combined into one, and our column headers have also been promoted. Let's send this back to Excel. Now, in our source data, let's add a new column to our Region 2 sheet. Remember to save, and let's go back to our query and hit refresh. And now we can see our new column that's been added.